Good afternoon, students and research scholars and colleagues. This is an opportunity to know the latest developments in geopolitics, especially in the area of Taiwan and China. Professor M.D. Nalapat, our honorary director, agreed to talk on the geopolitics, the impact of geopolitics on the China-Taiwan tensions. So I welcome him and hand over the mic to him to start the program.
Thank you very much. I'm happy to be here. And I did spend about a little over 3 weeks in that particular area, Taiwan, Singapore, the Pacific. And the good news is that the typhoons decided to stay away from wherever I was at a particular point in time. Otherwise, it gets a bit wet out there and a bit windy. So we are going, essentially the subject that's been given to me by by Ravi is the question of the Taiwan-China tensions and the geopolitics surrounding it, or rather the impact of geopolitics on Taiwan-China tensions. I'm sure that everyone in this class has understood quite a lot of the basics of the tension between Taiwan and China, and exactly what the Chinese were up to, things like that. So I'll just go through a very brief rundown of the situation, beginning from 1949. The fact was Taiwan was a Japanese colony. In 1945, the Japanese surrendered it. Then essentially, it was virtually self-governing. And finally, in 1949, as you know, Chiang Kai-shek lost what he called the mainland to the Communist Party of China, and he and a large part of his senior officers and military crossed into Taiwan and took up residence there. Now, the fact is, Taiwan has seen migrations from Fujian especially for quite some time, several hundreds of years. You had for about 200 years ago a major migration. Even about 300 years ago there were migrations from Fujian. And the Fujianis are a very interesting province of China. You know that in India as well, different provinces, different states have, according to a lot of people, different characteristics. And the Fujianese characteristic, they like gambling. They are gamblers. And I think, crossing over the Taiwan Straits, going into an island which is so very different from the mainland was a bit of a gamble, but many Fujianese decided to make that trip. And so what we call the Taiwanese are essentially, most of them are from Fujian, and they speak a particular dialect which is a kind of an adaptation of that dialect. So they are called the Taiwanese. So when you talk about Taiwanese and you talk about mainlanders, essentially mainlanders refers to the group that came with Chiang Kai-shek in 1949. And for a few years after that, during the time when Mao was consolidating his hold, you had people coming into Taiwan at regular intervals, not too many of them. The large cohort came in 49 and 50. So the difference between Taiwanese and mainlanders, almost all of them are from the Chinese mainland, but the Taiwanese, so named, are people who have settled there for about 100, 150, 200, a little more years. And the mainlanders are those who came in 1949. Now, Chiang Kai-shek liked control, and he and his mainlanders almost treated Taiwan as an occupied island, as an occupied country. They grabbed the best land, they grabbed the best opportunities, they grabbed whatever resources were there, etc., etc. As a consequence, there was a kind of tension between them and the quote-unquote Taiwanese, that is the ex-Fujianese who have been resident there. Now, Taiwan is an interesting society because you have a certain amount of individuals there who can be called from the South Sea Islands. You know, you have the South Sea Islands, fascinating places, small island countries of the Pacific you have there, many of them. Some of them are still recognized Taiwan. Others have switched over to the People's Republic of China. But essentially they are distinct cultures. The Tonga is a country, for example, in that location with a very distinct culture and almost a sense of leadership over the other Pacific islands. The Tongan royalty is considered to be, you know, in a sense, an elite within the Pacific Island community, which is a very interesting societal ecosystem. So you have bits and pieces of that in Taiwan. You have this Fujianese influence. You have the adaptation, I would say not so much Fujianese as Fujianese, but the adaptation of Fujianese into the circumstance of Taiwan. And then you have this mainlander, well, what the Taiwanese called an invasion, but I mean, anyway, so you have that. So it's a very interesting and complex kind of mix of societal influences that have been active on this island country. For all practical purposes, and if you are working in terms of geopolitics and defining reality, Taiwan is a country. Technically, because of the problem of Chinese hostility to the use of that particular term, it's called different things, but it's actually a separate country. And it's now very much a separate country, especially because politically it has evolved in a direction very different from the direction taken by the People's Republic of China. So we're not going to talk about mainland and the island of Taiwan, because as far as Taiwan is concerned, China is not the mainland, China is China. It's entirely separate. The Sri Lankans don't consider India to be the mainland. At least I haven't met any Sri Lankan who considers India to be the mainland. It's India and we are Sri Lanka according to them. So we are Taiwanese and this is the mainland of China. So from that point of view, let's define it as China and Taiwan. The Taiwanese, you had Chiang Kai-shek. After Chiang passed on, it was a pretty tough and fairly, if I may say so, a very clear tilt towards mainlanders. Chiang never really trusted the Fujianese or cared very much about them. So there was a certain amount of discrimination, a lot of discrimination against the Taiwanese. There was of course no question of democracy. Chiang Kai-shek ran his country the way Mao ran his country as an authoritarian dictatorship. But his son then took over, Chiang Ching-kuo. And Chiang Ching-kuo decided that there was a huge shock in the 1970s. I think the Japanese, if I'm not mistaken, called it the Nixon Shoku or something. But the shock was that all of a sudden, the United States, which was the protector of Taiwan, Taiwanese identity, Taiwanese security, kicked Taiwan under the bus and jumped onto the bandwagon of China. Now the reason for that was Cold War 1.0. China very wisely decided to join hands with the United States to confront a common enemy, which was the Soviet Union. And this is not a recent enemy. It was not just in the 70s. Right from the end of the 50s, Mao Zedong had been chafing under the belief of the USSR leadership, the CPSU, the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, their leadership, that they were the vanguard of the international communist movement. According to Mao, China was the shining light of the international communist movement, and China was the natural vanguard, and these chaps were usurpers If I'm not mistaken, he used to call them capitalist roaders. And he had some other epithets for them, which I don't propose to but they're quite easily accessible. So the fact of the matter is that when when we talk in those terms, this coming together of the United States and China happened very significantly as a consequence of the perception of Mao Zedong that it's always better to have the enemy of my enemy on my side. In other words, the real enemy is not the United States, the capitalist country. It's the capitalist roader country that pretends to be a socialist country, which is the Soviet Union. For some odd reason, Mao decided that the Soviet Union was a wannabe capitalist country. They were not capitalist, but they wanted to be capitalist, and they were pretending to be socialist, so they were in extreme danger. Unfortunately for Mao, in the continent of Europe, where there was a huge battle between the Soviet Union and China for influence, the only country that went on China's side was Albania. Enver Hoxha, etc. If you go back to history, you'll see that Albania was very loyal to China, and Albania also called the Soviet Union capitalist roaders. Fortunately, it was too small for Khrushchev to bother about, or Brezhnev to bother about, so there was no real invasion of Albania, unlike what we saw in Czechoslovakia, in Hungary, in Poland, in those locations where the Red Army, quite frankly, enforced the control of the USSR on those Eastern European countries. Today, the Eastern European countries are among the most anti-Russian in the continent of Europe. The Baltic countries were once part of the USSR. They are the most anti-Russian in the continent of Europe because in that particular period of time, Russians regarded themselves in a sense as if I may say so, the mainstay of the CPSU and the mainstay of the USSR. It's actually, Ukraine. If you take Ukraine, for example, for 30 years of the existence of the CPSU in power, from 2017 to 1991 end, up to 1992, 30 years, Ukrainians were in command as general secretaries of the CPSU. You had significant Ukrainian general secretaries in the CPSU, very important general secretaries. You check check your data and find out which general secretaries of the CPSU I'm talking about, when I can say that 30% in the life of the USSR, the CPSU, Ukrainians were in command. So you cannot really say they were a discriminated group in the USSR. They were certainly not. They were in fact a privileged, an advantaged group in the USSR, contrary to the history that we are hearing now, that Ukrainians were a persecuted group by the Russians. Anyway, so when we come to that kind of a situation, so you see that Chiang Ching-kuo realized that the Western governments were increasingly turning to China. And it's very important to understand that in the case of India and the United States, for example, our relationship with the United States is bottom-up. You had a large number of Indians migrating to the United States, not enough because passports were very difficult to get in the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s. Rajiv Gandhi tried to make some difference in that. He did make some difference, but the real differences were made in the 1990s, where it was much easier to get a passport. In the age of Nehru and Indira Gandhi and all that, getting a passport was not an easy task. Whereas in Pakistan, they were given away by the bucket to anybody who wanted them, with the result that today you see a huge amount of the Pakistani diaspora in the UK, but relative to population, not a very large Indian diaspora. A lot of the Indian diaspora, so-called in the UK, comes from Kenya and other locations, Uganda, for example, other locations in Africa where where a section of society and the leadership turned against the the Indians who were resident in Africa, and as a consequence they had to flee, and many of them fled to the UK. With those passports they could flee easily, in a way that people in India who frankly found it difficult to get a passport could not flee. Just one of the chances that we missed. But anyway, so from that perspective, he decided that you have to appeal to the population of these countries. And one way of doing that was to play the democracy card. So Chiang Kai-shek's son Chiang Ching-kuo, and he believed that the KMT was everywhere, in any kind of government job, in any kind of institution of privilege. Unless you were a KMT member, you didn't really get admission. And with the going away of Chiang Kai-shek, the going away of the monopoly almost of mainlanders over positions of authority disappeared. From Chiang Ching-kuo's time, you could have Taiwanese, that is Fujianese, mostly, almost entirely, have, in a sense, participation in the higher realms of power in Taiwan. So more and more Taiwanese started coming to higher positions in Chiang Ching-kuo's time, and Chiang Ching-kuo, the son of Chiang Kai-shek, is credited of introducing the first election in Taiwan. This was a means of ensuring that Taiwan was seen as a legitimate entity supported by its own people, in contrast to the entity that was being supported by the government of the United States and increasingly by governments of other countries. Canada, actually, Justin Trudeau's father, Pierre Trudeau, was among the first politicians to reach out to Communist China, even before the Americans did. And he was very friendly to China, and whether that's good news or bad, sensible or not, his son Justin Trudeau has always also been very accommodative to China. So the father is, at least in that respect, following in the son is following the footsteps of the father. So in this election, you had an election, and you had native Taiwanese, so-called, come to power, Li Denghui. And Li Denghui was, Chiang Ching-kuo would probably not really have factored in what Li Denghui would do once in power. He thought by having somebody who is not a mainlander be the presidential candidate of the KMT itself will be more acceptable to the Taiwanese, which is of course the majority population in a democracy. And so he put forward a Taiwanese candidate, and Li Denghui actually was not just Taiwanese, he was a Taiwanese who was intensely pro-Japanese. In other words, he preferred the Japanese occupation to any kind of future occupation by China, and he certainly had a very strong partiality towards Taiwanese, as we had defined them, rather than mainlanders. That was really a very pivotal moment for Taiwan, because in Taiwan for the first time, the Taiwanese, so-called, came to the highest position of the president of Taiwan. And the Taiwanese president at that point in time, and even now, it's like the American presidency. It's a very strong executive presidency. In fact, the government is appointed by the president, and a lot of the responsibilities of state go to the president rather than to the elected legislature. So you have the executive, you have the legislature, you have the judiciary, and the executive is extremely powerful in Taiwan and is directly elected by the people. So the first elected president was Li Denghui, and it was during Li Denghui's time that I made my first visit to Taiwan, as a matter of fact, around the time of the third crisis in the Taiwan Straits. The first crisis, of course, was the movement of large numbers of individuals from China into Taiwan, 1949, 1950, etc., 51, 52, 53. There was shelling, if you remember, Quemoy, Matsu, etc. That was the first Taiwanese thing. The second was again a huge amount of shelling on both sides. In fact, thousands of lives were at risk. Thousands of lives, according to records, were lost on both sides because Chiang Kai-shek threw at the Chinese what a lot of the equipment and weapons that the Americans had supplied him. So he was pretty well supplied. So there was a huge exchange of fire, and 1958 was the second Taiwan Straits crisis. Early 50s the first one, 58 the second one, and the was 95. And it was during the third crisis that around the time of the third crisis, that I decided to make my first visit to this country, which had already started establishing itself as a very major force in technology. If you know, on visits to the United States, especially to California, you could see that Taiwanese were playing a very important role in the software industry, which was just coming into play at that point in time. And in that situation, you go to Taiwan, you'll see these companies were coming up at that point in time. So essentially, my calculation was that this is going to be a techno major power. In fact, it's now become almost a techno superpower. But at that point in time, my calculation was it will be a superpower. Why not, know something more about it? So I started going to Taiwan around that time. And a few years earlier, I was one of the people arguing very strongly for India to have full recognition of Taiwan in the sense of America, other countries have recognition, Israel and Taiwan. And there were discussions back and forth. Narasimha Rao was the Prime Minister. Some of us, even though the one point was access to the top. So during access, you can make your point quite clearly. And during a few of those, when these points were being made at the highest levels, you had some Taiwanese also present. So they could see who was arguing on behalf of Taiwan. And they had a soft corner to those very few people who were arguing on behalf of Taiwan at that point in time. When Narasimha Rao took a very correct decision and established diplomatic relationship with Taiwan. For some time, it was a very, it is a bit of a tentative relationship. For example, when you visited Taiwan, you had to have a kind of like when you visited Israel, you had to have a sheet of paper that was stuck onto your passport. And when you get back, that sheet is stamped and it's removed. Because if you have a Taiwanese visa, you're not allowed to go to China. And if you have an Israeli visa, you are not allowed to go anywhere in the Middle East. Well, times have changed. I've gone to Iran with an Israeli visa very strongly marked on my passport, and I really didn't meet any problem at immigration or anywhere else as a consequence of that particular Israeli. So times change, of course, but in those days, it was this, post-it visa, that kind of thing. Then it became a normal visa. Today, the Taiwan office in India and the India office in Taiwan, in the old days it used to be retired bureaucrats, retired foreign service officers. So you could say that these are non-officials. After that, India started posting its own diplomats, and Taiwan from the very beginning started posting seasoned diplomats from the Taiwanese diplomatic service to India, which Li Denghui, quite frankly, did not really regard as an important country. This story has been told before. I don't want to, but since it'll take about 25 seconds, I'll maybe reproduce it here. India was not in a great shape in 1992 when Rao took over. In fact, it was in pretty bad shape. And there was an approach made to Taiwan and an approach made to Japan for $1 billion, and if I recall correctly, $1 billion and $2 billion respectively, of emergency assistance. Li Denghui refused to give that $1 billion. I'm not sure if it is 2 and 4 or 1 and 2, but whatever that is, that's again, I'm sure easily, you can easily find that out. Li Denghui said, what India? Who the hell cares about India? I mean, we don't care about India. Personally, I think he lost a big opportunity because that didn't exactly help his goodwill, because the Indian government under Prime Minister Rao had just given Taiwan recognition, and 1 billion was not much to Taiwan. Even at that point in time, it was a fairly well-off country. But they said nothing doing, not $100 to India. And that was Mr. Lee Teng-hui, President Lee Teng-hui. Whereas the Japanese, if I'm not mistaken, we asked for $2 billion, and if I'm not mistaken, they gave more than that. So the Japanese, early on in 1990s itself, established a feeling in India that they were a reliable partner of India in a way that the Taiwanese failed to do at that point in time. So Lee Teng-hui must have done a lot of good things, done a lot of not so good things, and I think from my point of view as a citizen of India, not giving that $1 billion to India was not a smart decision. Because anyway, but the good news is hardly anyone remembers that now. So that's forgotten, and I'm sure it's been forgiven. So I'd only like to point out that, so that was the evolution of Taiwan. So Lee Teng-hui made it absolutely clear that he, as a Taiwanese, has no intention of ever being part of the People's Republic of China in any shape or form. At that point, after 1997, Deng Xiaoping introduced this one country, two systems model in Hong Kong, what he called the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region, HKSAR. You had the Macau Special Administrative Region, you had the Hong Kong HKSAR, and actually it was quite different from mainland China. For example, a lot of the internet sites that were banned in China were available in Hong Kong. The same sites that you could get in California, you could get in Hong Kong. A lot of other ways, Hong Kong was very different from the mainland. You land up in Hong Kong, I mean, when Gmail was banned in the mainland, I used to have my Gmail account functioning very well in Hong Kong, but the minute you cross over to the mainland, unless you get hold of a VPN, which I never bothered to do because I said there's no point, I'd rather not break the law. I mean, you may not like the law in any particular country, but it's important not to break it unless you absent-mindedly cross some borders of the country into some other countries in some point of time. And borders are not defined, so if you absent-mindedly cross and spend some time, then it's a different matter. Otherwise, the point is that Hong Kong was different. Unfortunately, for the Hong Kongers, they saw themselves as being a little too different. And if I'm not mistaken, in 2019, there were a huge amount of manifestations when Comrade Xi Jinping, who believes that the Communist Party of China, led by himself, is the answer to all the world's problems. And he is by far and away the most competent leader ever to have been in charge in China, or in fact the most competent leader anywhere in the world. Now, that's his image, the image of his admirers. History will judge whether he was right or wrong. I am not competent enough to judge whether Mr. Xi Jinping is or was or is going to be judged as that. But anyway, the fact is that Hong Kong, the one country, two systems, was actually designed by Deng as a bait to Taiwan. Because the 1980s were actually an ideal period when there could have been a takeover by the PRC of Taiwan. In my view, this is an aspect of Sino-Taiwanese relations that really has not been touched upon very extensively. I've been interested in that from some time. The 1980s, if you go into that, you still had a dictatorship, changing, a kind of a semi-dictatorship, but a dictatorship. If the CCP had reached out to the KMT, and if they had given the KMT some role in office in Beijing, who knows? I mean, you have all, even today, there are people in the government in China, in the so-called National People's Congress, in some presumed leadership groups in China, in which there are some parties, not the CCP, that are there. If they had said, all right, you also become, members of the whatever this thing, have some kind of an adjustment. It may have been possible to persuade elements in the KMT to agree to a merger, because the old mainland cohort, to this day, I mean, I've met people in Taiwan who are well into their 90s now, and who when their great grandchildren come to them, they keep sweets, Chinese sweets, and they ask the great grandchildren, "What are you?" And if any grandchild says Taiwanese, no sweets. The minute the grandchild says Chinese, the sweets are given. So I can tell you, the most fanatic Taiwanese among the grandchildren, they all know how to say Chinese, Chinese. They get their sweets and they go out and say, "Well, we fooled great granddaddy once again." But anyway, so there were a large number of mainlanders who were really sentimental about coming back to the mainland. So I think the opportunity was there in the 1980s. Deng Xiaoping was not really a militaristic kind of guy. At the same time, he had an antipathy to the KMT. It's interesting that the KMT from around, especially from around the 21st century, seems to have drifted towards the CCP, because the CCP and the KMT were enemies of each other. They fought each other, they killed each other. But from the 21st century, KMT became a very pro-CCP party, interestingly, as compared to the DPP, which was never pro-CCP at all. It was, pro-US, pro-Japan, but definitely not pro-CCP. But at that point in time, there was an opportunity, in my view, of negotiating with the KMT, having some kind of a peace settlement, and, well, something which would have been terrible from all our point of view, the Chinese PLA occupying Taiwan, and once it is occupied, you can see what happened in Hong Kong. In 2019, you had the manifestations. In 2020, you had the national security law passed by the Chinese People's Congress. Surprise, surprise, I don't think there was any vote against it. If there was a vote or two against it, I don't remember that particular vote. And soon after that, Mr. Xi Jinping ensured the end of one country, two systems, well before the 2047 deadline, which was set by the Hong Kong Accord. I think it was supposed to go on for 50 years or something. So for 1997, 50 years, whatever it is, well, certainly this should have continued by now. He ended. So now there is one country, one system. Hong Kong is very much part of that one country, one system model. So any talk of Taiwan going in for one country, three systems, which was actually a concept introduced by somebody in the Department of Geopolitics in discussions with people on the mainland as to hypothetical situations. One, Hong Kong at that point in time, two systems working very strongly. Jiang Zemin's time. Hu Jintao's time, it started getting watered down. In Jiang Zemin's time, it was really operating pretty well. Hong Kong was really quite different. But, so three systems, with Taiwan has its own flag, army, etc., etc. And, technically, it acknowledges its, ROC, and, whatever, and technically, that kind of thing. So very technical, no military occupation. So the three system. Once Hong Kong folded up, it was very clear that even this one country, three systems would not have really worked, because Comrade Xi would not have, if he didn't want one country, two systems, he would not have wanted one country, three systems. So that opportunity was lost. From that time onwards, the fact is that the trajectory of democracy in Taiwan proceeded quite rapidly. And you had this other party form, which is the Democratic Progressive Party. Essentially, it had its roots in the human rights movement, in the movement for recognition of the rights of the Taiwanese people, in the movement for human dignity, in the movement to prevent overlordship of the mainlanders or whatever it is in Taiwanese society. It is essentially a domestic agenda, but a clear domestic agenda which stressed the separate identity of Taiwan as compared to China. Now what's interesting is that the bulk of the individuals who are in the DPP are also from ethnic Chinese. They are in fact ethnic Han. And in some respects you can say the traditional Chinese culture, like the tea ceremony for example, some aspects of Chinese opera are kept alive in a much more concentrated form in Taiwan than they have been in the mainland. In the mainland, they've been diluted by the need to infuse a certain amount of communism, of Mao Zedong thought, if I may say so, into the ancient classics. Now, I don't think very much of the classics survive the onslaught of Mao Zedong thought. So what you have as Chinese classics and Chinese opera performed in China or even the tea ceremony, there are differences in China as compared to the tea ceremony in Taiwan, where actually it has been much more pristine and much more closer to the original Chinese culture. So, in that sense, Taiwan is very much part of the Sinic world. And therefore, I come to my core point, a point that I've been making for quite some time, which is that the worst thing that could happen to the Communist Party of China would be to take over Taiwan. Why? Because the Taiwanese are now completely integrated and embedded in the concept of democracy. You would have a very discontented number of people in mainland China who believe in democracy, who have got good skill in the knowledge economy, and who would never fit into the kind of regimented society that the CCP does. And the second point I had made earlier on, I saw large numbers of Chinese coming to Taiwan, people from the other side of the Taiwan Straits. And you would not see them in the evenings. You know, they would go crazily shopping in the morning. They would go crazily sightseeing in the daytime. And when I say crazily, they remind me of Japanese also, because if you can see 20 sights in one morning is better than seeing 10 sights. Personally, I am a guy who believes you should see one sight every 20 days. I think sometimes that is a bit too much for me. Although, I mean, you know, my wife disagrees. She's a little more Japanese and a little more Chinese in wanting to see as many more sights as possible. But the fact is that in the evenings, I wouldn't see these mainlanders. And by that time, I had come to recognize the accent, the behavior of people who are coming from the mainland, from the people who are actually resident in Taiwan, because there were different cultural characteristics, different behavioral and habit patterns. So you can make out a mainlander from a Taiwanese, or rather a Chinese from, I'm breaking my own rule, a Chinese from a Taiwanese. So I asked, why on earth are these chaps not coming out? Shops are there in the open. You've got the night market. I saw it once. I've never seen it again, thank God, because one of the sights I saw was a huge laboratory bowl, and there was a snake in it. And anyway, somebody took a knife and slit that snake from here to there. And the snake was looking at me all the time when it was being slit. So that was supposed to be for dinner. I lost my appetite and I didn't regain it for at least 2 days after that. But personally, I mean, that was the end of any desire to visit the night market or any desire to even think of anywhere near where you have any location where you sell snakes. Look, I'm not finding fault with that. It's a culinary preference, but I do believe that the snake needed to be consulted on that. And I don't think this particular snake was consulted. But anyway, so the reality of the situation is they were all watching Taiwanese television. Now, Taiwanese television is a Tower of Babel. If you think that Indian talk shows are a Tower of Babel, well, you have not seen Taiwanese television. Taiwanese television will make Indian television look like talk shows on CGTN. And of course, CGTN is a very respected channel. It's the official broadcaster of the People's Republic of China. Yesterday I taped my latest show in CGTN. It will come out in a few days, hopefully. Dialogue program on 75 years of Indian independence. It's a theme that I'm interested in, and despite my less than wholehearted appreciation for certain important figures in China or the policy of the Chinese Communist Party, for some, the CGTN still invites me off and on, whatever, because in any case, one thing is clear, I do have a lot of regard for Chinese people, for Chinese culture, and appreciation for the fact that the Communist Party of China has made this country a superpower, like it or not. But anyway, check on Dialogue program. In a few days from now, you'll see the next episode of Dialogue put up, and usually there are no cuts in what I say. I'm diplomatic, but I put the Indian point of view very clearly, and I must give them credit for that, they put it up. But anyway, having said that, I mean, why would you want to watch a Taiwanese talk show? I spent a little bit of time after that coming back to my hotel room and tuning on the talk shows, and frankly, I just couldn't bear it. They were all shouting at each other. One political party person was saying that you are whatever, whatever. The other political party was saying you are the son of whatever, whatever. You are the daughter of whatever, whatever. And a lot of whatevers were flying around the place. And why any sensible individual would want to watch this kind of thing was beyond me. But the reality was the Chinese were amazed. These people were talking about the president of Taiwan. People were talking about the prime minister of Taiwan in terms that, you know, and I mean no disrespect to the sailors. Sailors, in fact, are far more polite than they're given credit for. But we all have been told that mariners use very salty language. I can assure you that if the Chinese had used any such salt when they to their president, or their prime minister, I think those Chinese will have the benefit of being state guests for a very extended period of time. So in Taiwan, somebody in the middle of the road says, "Oh, what do you think about the prime minister?" The prime minister is dash dash dash. I'm not going to go further into dash dash dash, except that I cannot repeat it in any kind of company. You know, if I did repeat it, I would be betraying my parents, because they tried to give some kind of civilization to me, but wholly terrible language. So they were fascinated. Here you have a country where top people, powerful people, are being called dot 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 dash 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 every day, not in secret, not on the kitchen table, not with all the doors and windows closed, not in a hush, but publicly on television, publicly in newspapers. You have these tabloid newspapers in which sometimes you have the president's face in tabloid, and what comes under that is something absolutely horrible. Again, I don't want to repeat it, but it's not very complimentary to the president. But that was fascinating to the mainland Chinese. Now, the argument used by the Chinese Communist Party was, well, look at Taiwan. We are growing much faster than Taiwan, which is true actually. Taiwanese actually were not growing so fast because they're already a very developed society. Their per capita income is way above that of China, even today. In fact, it's much above that of Hong Kong. But the reality is that look at their buildings. And yes, Taipei, you don't have the kind of grand new construction, new bridges, new roads, new superstructure. Taipei, Kaohsiung, any of these locations in Taiwan, you don't have that. China, you've got grand construction. Terrific. You don't have that in Taipei. Look at all the terrific construction that we have. Look at these fantastic roads. Look at these huge, beautiful cities. What is this little backwater compared to us? Nothing. So the fact is, democracy can't give you this kind of magnificence. It can't give you economic growth to the extent that we can. But what happens when your economic growth falls behind? What happens when these great buildings are unoccupied? What happens when that infrastructure starts getting into trouble because of weather and climatic changes? The Taiwanese don't look so bad after that. So the reality is, a large part of the democracy movement in China came when a large number of Han Chinese stopped buying into the CCP maxim that if you're Han, the policy, the party, the ideology, the governance system that is suited for you is the governance system of the CCP, the top-down system, in which your duty is to obey. I think there's some English song or something or poem, ours not to question why, ours to do and die, or do or die, whatever. So I think that is exactly the CCP motto. Don't question the General Secretary, you do or die. And if you do question the General Secretary, you're not going to die, but you're certainly going to understand very soon that you made a fairly significant mistake. That's the system there. But the point is that Taiwan was doing pretty well, is doing pretty well. And today, what happened, Xi Jinping thought that if you cut away a lot of these, linkages from Taiwan, you cut away, for example, the people-to-people linkages, cut away the transport linkages, then Taiwan will collapse. That is again part of the story, that the Taiwanese will collapse if the mainland, quote-unquote, pulls away its support systems. Taiwanese are not collapsing. Chinese are not buying their vegetables. They are selling it to Japan. They are selling it to Southeast Asia. They are selling it to Europe. And today, after this Chinese bullying, there's a big premium for Taiwanese fruit. In fact, Taiwanese mangoes are absolutely delicious, but I would still say I prefer our own mangoes because they're smaller. Taiwanese mangoes are too large to be consumed. But in any case, the fact is that the Taiwanese have really shrugged off this Chinese pressure, and they're doing very well. Their tech companies are doing very well, and they're slowly decoupling from China. Some of them are coming to India. You have Foxconn come to India. Apple now slowly is coming into India. If it comes to India, Taiwan will be a very important player in having Taiwanese. In fact, that's one reason why I favor at least a tech free trade deal between India and Taiwan. I don't know if our diplomats will agree to it because they seem to be always looking at China when they decide decisions regarding Taiwan. Even today, it's different, but not as different as some of us would like. But in any case, the fact is that Taiwan has not really been kneecapped by all these ways of China trying to punish it. The more it punishes Taiwan, the more other countries come in and help Taiwan. With the result, Taiwan is now quite fine, thank you, and doing very well. This is a problem for the Communist Party of China. The first problem is proof that democracy works for Han people. The Taiwanese are essentially Han people. Now, there are some Han in Taiwan who don't like me saying it. They say, no, we're not really Han, we are this and that. But they are Han, for God's sake. They are ethnically Han. And this Singapore, you can say, is a semi-ordered society. It's certainly not as freewheeling as Taiwanese society. Taiwanese society, and all you got to do is to access any talk show on your, on your internet, and believe me, you will not want to watch it a second time, because even if you understand the language, immediately you will switch off. If you don't understand the language, you may hang on for a few hours maybe, but otherwise because it's just abuse, and more abuse. That's about it, of anyone, because Taiwan is a kind of country which it's a democracy. It's a freewheeling democracy. And in a democracy, there's a lot of chaos. There's a lot of brickbats, verbal brickbats flying here and there. I mean, you can see in India, for example, that both sides are calling each other absolutely deadly to the future of India. We are supposed to be a fascist dictatorship. Now, we are supposed to be a country where minorities have been completely eliminated. I mean, fortunately, that's not the case, because had it been the case, I think a lot of us would have lost people in our families. But the other side is supposed to be a bunch of people who are completely in the pay of China, or who are completely, absolute, out to destroy India, destroy the unity of India. Well, I mean, I don't know. But welcome to democracy. The fact of the matter is, Taiwan has shown that the Han people are perfectly, Han culture, Han civilization, are completely and perfectly compatible with democracy, and in fact, ideally suited to democracy. It's a very difficult thing for the Communist Party of China to accept. And the second thing that has been shown is that Taiwan is shown it does not need China for its economic prosperity. You look at the per capita figures in Taiwan. You look at the rate of growth in Taiwan. You look at it after this new government came, DPP, led by Tsai Ing-wen. I mean, the first DPP government, again, Taiwan really didn't suffer very much. The second DPP government, Tsai Ing-wen, she's had this Act East, look, Act East policy. So that's Modi's Act East policy has found a perfect complement in Tsai Ing-wen's Look East policy. So you look east, you act east, with the result that the linkages between India and Taiwan, for example, have grown very significantly. The Indian ambassador, the Indian representative in Taiwan is a very important figure. And for the first time, the Taiwanese representative in Delhi is also a significant player in the diplomatic circuit. It's not like in the past where he was ignored. Today, he's a significant player in the diplomatic circuit, and the Indian representative in Taiwan is an important player, very important player, ranking alongside the US ambassador, the Japanese ambassador, in terms of importance to the Taiwanese government. So you have this, if I may say so, I always believe that existential battles are fought on the basis of battles between systems. When you have two systems that are involved in a battle against each other, and that battle is considered to be an existential battle, then you have a lot of tension between these countries. And the system in Taiwan and the system in China, both countries comprising of Han population, there is a complete, absolute lack of congruence between them, and there is therefore a systemic conflict, which is why it's important. Hong Kong, the fact that Hong Kong was doing extremely well under two systems, that having Google, having a lot of freedoms which are not there in the People's Republic of China, in the mainland of China, and yet Hong Kong was doing swimmingly, it was not a good example for people in mainland China to come to Hong Kong and find out that, look, I can access Google, but nothing very bad is happening. I can access a lot of things that I cannot access back home. And they would go to Hong Kong and they would empty the shelves of Hong Kong and go back, and the Hong Kong people eventually started disliking the mainlanders because they were crazy shoppers. They didn't know the mainlanders are crazy shoppers anywhere. You have Chinese tourists coming to India, they're crazy shoppers. You have Chinese tourists going to Europe, they're crazy shoppers. They're just crazy shoppers, period. Japanese also, I think, are also fairly, much addicted to shopping. But anyway, so what I want to say, this is the root of the tension. It's not that China, second, of course, is the strategic angle. The angle that Taiwan is in the first island chain of defense. And if you occupy Taiwan, you are breaking through the first island chain of defense. Immediately, the defense of Japan becomes problematic. The defense of South Korea becomes problematic. The defense of the Philippines becomes problematic. Vietnam, India, Indonesia, Thailand, all these countries, their defensive capabilities in the Indo-Pacific shrink considerably. So before, we just dismiss it as just another little conflict which is far away, the reality is that the loss of Taiwan would result in a tectonic shift in the balance of power in the Indo-Pacific and make it very much more difficult to ensure the existence of, in Prime Minister Modi's words, a free, open and inclusive Indo-Pacific. Prime Minister Modi is not talking about excluding China. Far from it. It's an inclusive Indo-Pacific. But in India, we were very much opposed to a unipolar world led by the United States. We never wanted that. We said no single country should be a unipolar, there cannot be a unipolar world. It's not a healthy world. Like you need two legs, in the sense of there. You need at least two, if not, in fact, multiple poles. Multiple poles are far better than just two poles. So if we fought the unipolar world of the United States, it's only correct that we battle a unipolar world which is being sought by the CCP, or rather openly under Xi Jinping, to take place. Now, as far as the Chinese Communist Party is concerned, they have been looking for a unipolar world for the last 100 years of their existence. Mao Zedong worked very hard from 1949 onwards for a unipolar world. All his tactics were built towards that strategy. The good thing about Xi Jinping, he's more transparent. Jiang Zemin, Hu Jintao, Deng Xiaoping especially, completely translucent. You could never see into the mind of Deng. Deng was a hardened communist. He was a hardened believer in the absolute control of the Communist Party. As hardened a believer as Mao. But his tactics were different. The strategy was the same. The objective was the same. The methods and tactics were different, that's all. But Xi Jinping, he is much more transparent. And in that sense, he has given us fair warning of what to expect. With the result that the rest of the world is now slowly coming together in trying to ensure that the Indo-Pacific remains, inclusive and it remains free and open. Now already South China Sea, about 80% of it is under the effective military control of the PLA. It's virtually a Chinese lake now. Taiwan, if it goes, the knowledge economy goes for a 6. Definitely China will get a major leg up in the knowledge industry, because whether it is TSMC, whether it is USMC, some of the major producers of essential components of the knowledge industry are located in Taiwan. TSMC, we have been trying to get TSMC in India for quite some time. I think the Taiwanese want to be absolutely certain that we are not pro-Chinese. I mean, odd as it sounds, when I go to China, when I go to Taiwan, and I say, why isn't TSMC in India? It's a beautiful market, a domestic market. And if you produce from, let's say, Udupi, you can sell to Africa, you can sell to Europe, you can sell to, to the Arab countries. Why aren't you here? And the surprising answer I get is, we are not entirely sure that you chaps are really opposed to China. That's odd because of the situation of the border and all that. But they believe that we are not 100% with the rest of the Quad in the battle against China, mainly because when the 3 Quad countries taken an initiative on China, India has, for diplomatic reasons, kept out. Now, I think we are as firmly on board, whether it's in the Quad or anywhere else, as any other country in ensuring that we don't want a unipolar world. But these chaps say that these are our crown jewels. TSMC, UMC, these are the crown jewels. We are shifting from China because it's not safe to be in China. We don't want to be in any country that has any influence in which the Chinese influence is there. And for that reason, I think they are kind of oddly, they're still not convinced that India is as much committed to a free, open and inclusive Indo-Pacific and is willing to ensure that it goes the extra mile in defending that. We are willing to go the extra mile, especially under Prime Minister Modi. I am convinced of that as an analyst. I've been convinced of that from his activities. But I think more and more the Taiwanese are getting convinced of that. And once they get convinced of that, I'm sure one of the major locations for production by TSMC, UMC, etc., which will be good from their own point of view, their own future development point of view, will be India, potentially the south coast. And why not Udupi, for example? It's an ideal location for that kind of thing, because you've got Africa, you've got all that. On the east coast also, you've got in Southeast Asia, but they can service that. The west coast is ideal for new markets. And I think that's finally going to happen. So I just wanted to say, for all these reasons, it's very embarrassing for the CCP to have a democratic Taiwan, to have a Taiwan that does not acknowledge in any way the overlordship of China, to have a Taiwan that despite its democracy is functioning very well. And in fact, India is also a problem for them because it's functioning quite well. It's a democracy. And for a long time, they say, oh, look at the chaos there, look at the rate of growth there. Today, our rate of growth is higher than that of China. We are doing pretty well. So it's a little embarrassing for them, because for them, for a democracy to succeed in the way an authoritarian state does, is a systemic threat to their regime. So Taiwanese represent a major systemic threat, which is where this tension comes from. Now it's an entirely different situation as to the military options, what is going to happen, what is likely to happen. I think that will take, in fact, an entirely different lecture, and I'm not going to go into that. There are limitations of time, and as Ravi is telling me, I'd like to see what you chaps are doing. I mean, rather than you listen to me, I'd like to listen to you. So from that point of view, I'm not going to go into the defense except to say that all the democracies, we face a common threat, and all the democracies need to work together, because the fall of any democracy affects every democracy in the Indo-Pacific. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. It's a wonderful deliberation.